I always have considered myself a quick study. And therefore, shortly after I was ordained, I sort of discovered a problem in the weddings that our parish was having and set about to find a solution to it. Now, I know this would never happen here, but in that parish in Cleveland, when wedding rehearsal night came, the parents of the groom or the parents of the bride would come to me and say what the groom or the bride wanted for the wedding. Now, this usually had nothing to do with what the groom or the bride wanted, but what the parents of the groom and the bride wanted. And so I discovered quickly enough that I would spend a whole session with the bride and the groom in the church and figure out exactly what they wanted. Then when the parents came to me, I would say, "I'm sorry, I'm the priest, we're going to have it this way." They would get angry at me, but not their daughter or their son. I thought this was a perfect solution to the problem until about 7 or 8 months after I was ordained, and my brother had a wedding. Wouldn't you know that my mother came to me and told me what my brother wanted? Well, I had done this already. I knew what my brother and his wife-to-be wanted. And so I did my spiel. "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm the priest. We're going to have it this way." And she said something to me that no one had ever done. "So what?" As far as she was concerned, I was Tommy. In fact, my mother died at the age of 86, 7 years ago, and I was still Tommy. I was not the priest. I was not at all anyone who was in charge of this wedding. I was her son. I didn't know that. I didn't remember that. And in a lot of ways, poor situation, she and I spoke past each other. Thank God the wedding turned out nicely, but there were little ruffled feathers there for a while. I saw myself one way. My mother saw me, as she always did, in a very different way. I think this story might shed some light on what today's gospel is about. Jesus comes home. Jesus, already known as a healer, comes home and preaches in the local synagogue. He's a rabbi. Our neighbor, Mary and Joseph's son, made good. But as he preaches, they start asking questions. This is Mary and Joseph's son. In fact, this is Mary's and Joseph's son. What does he possibly have to tell us who have known him since he was a baby? They knew him. They knew him, however, as the son of Joseph, and could not at all begin to understand he was also the Son of God. In today's second reading, Paul talks about knowledge. And basically, he tells us, I think, something very important that sheds so much light on this gospel it's not funny. He says, we all see partially. We all know partially. We all understand partially. And yet, sometimes we can take that partial seeing, that partial knowledge, that partial understanding, and believe that we know it all. And that partial understanding, as true as it is, therefore gets in the way of a more complete understanding, a more complete seeing, a more complete knowledge. The people of the town of Nazareth knew Jesus. But because they knew him, they could not really know him. Because they understood who he was, they couldn't really understand who he was. All of us come into this community with partial knowledge. All of us come into this community, I hope, with faith, with enthusiasm about our faith, with a desire to share that faith with others. And yet, that very enthusiasm, that very desire to share, can get us into trouble if we think we have it all. But what do we do about that? I think again it is Paul in today's second reading that was read so well just a few minutes ago, gives us the answer not in vague generalities, but in very concrete understanding. What Paul says is the only way out of this understanding that's partial, this knowledge that's partial, this seeing that's partial, is the virtue of love. And when Paul talks about love, it's not this vague, nice feeling. When Paul talks about love, it's a disciplined attitude. And again, remember what we just heard just a few minutes ago. What is love? Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not rejoice over the evil of others. It is not rude. It does not seek its own interests. It is not quick-tempered, nor does it brood over perceived injuries. Rather, as we try to share the gospel, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. The only way I believe that we can share that knowledge we have is to respect the knowledge of others. The only way we can be those excited, devoted disciples of Jesus is by truly loving the sisters and brothers that God has given us. To acknowledge our partial understanding and to argue it, but to listen to one another in the hope that our many partial understandings can become closer to the truth of who God is, of who Christ is. And we continue along that way with partial understandings, hopefully becoming clearer and clearer and clearer. We acknowledge those partial understandings and in humility learn from one another. What Paul tells us, I think, is the very core of what our faith is. We are a faith that is built on the virtue of love. And as we understand the partiality of much of our knowing, the partiality of much of our understanding, the partiality of much of our seeing, we also know that there is only one thing that St. Paul tells us that endures, and that is love. As he says time and time again, it is love, that discipline, that virtue of love that never fails.